I start with the sentence. The Soviet era was an active period in the art interaction between Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. From the end of the 60s on, the cooperation became especially frequent in the form of regional triennials in various art disciplines. As we can see in this slide, it was the cooperation was really very tight and always bold. Ones are the new triennials or biennials. But of course, looking at this slide, we should ask, firstly, if these exhibitions belong to the same format at all. Although having the common denominator of triennials or biennials, these undertakings might not have shared utterly the same purposes and ambitions. Indeed, some of these exhibitions were rotating between the Baltic countries, and some had this permanent host or permanent place. And even the free ones I have selected from this list to work with. Tallinn Print Triennial, Vilnius Painting Triennial, and Triennial of Young Artists, Baltic Young Artists, actually do differ in a way in their organizing principles and in ambitions as well. For example, inspired by international biennials of graphic arts in Ljubljana, they started from 55, and Krakow, Estonian artists initiated the Tallinn Print Triennials in 1968 with a primary ambition to establish a tradition in the spirit of international biennials. And these aims and ambitions were communicated quite publicly in reviews and in the discussions, so it was not a secret desire, but actually quite well communicated. And they even took some steps towards these goals. Since the second biennial from 1971, some small sections from the other parts of Soviet Union, they added in the triennial, although they had these exhibitions in different venues, so they were not actually included in this Baltic exposition. And in 74, which is the third triennial, actually there were requests from Schwerin and Szolnok, East Germany and Poland, which were these twin cities of Tallinn, which is almost international already. The proper international exhibition was succeeded only in 1989, in the very end of the Soviet era. But also they had this quite tight correspondence with, for example, art institutes of northern countries, asking to visit the triennials, and so on. But in a way, they really tried to communicate and tried to broaden the selection. And especially actively, it was made in, I forgot slides again, before the fifth triennial, which happened in 1980, and as we know, it was the time of Moscow Summer Olympics, yes. And this yacht regatta was in Tallinn, and it just really was at least in the 1979, the International Print Triennial was in the official booklet of a cultural program of this Olympics, but somehow it disappears. And this exhibition doesn't take place during this Olympic regatta anyway. But I have few ideas why it happens, and it might not have only been these ideological or official reasons. Okay. At the same time, Vilnius Painting Triennial included small section, this is the first print triennial, Looks good, isn't it? Looking good when compared with the first Ljubljana biennial. And included a small section of guests since the early 80s, but in fact the organizers did not aim to expand the triennial. And the Young Artists Triennial again was this cross-media exhibition, and again only for Baltic artists. Also, when Tallinn Print Triennial exposed always equal amount of works from each country, it was around 90 or let's say 30 artists, the Painting Triennial in Vilnius used the host privilege to expose 2 times more paintings than Estonia and Latvia. The hosts of triennials did not intervene into the selection of other countries' expositions, but when in Vilnius each country designed their own display, as was also the case in these exhibitions you, Carolina, told about. In Tallinn, the exhibition was arranged by a local designer, Enno Otšing, who actually designed all the exhibitions until the 89, all these print triennials. And he aspired for a unified picture, used the same hanging systems and framings for all the works, and later even intervened into the selection principles, allowing each artist to attend with 2 or 4 pictures instead of previous 3 for a better overall impression. Regardless of the differences, my research underlies these comparative aspects of Baltic triennials, and I plan to pay particular attention to the interconnections of Tallinn Print Triennial, Vilnius Painting Triennial, and Baltic Triennial of Young Artists. We're representing different art forms and being hosted by separate countries. The selection enables varied comparative perspectives on the subject, and furthermore, amidst the numerous Baltic triennials and biennials, these 3 were, at least in some respect, interconnected in their initial impulses. That is, being rejected by Estonian organizers for the proposal to host the second print triennial as a rotating exhibition, Vilnius Painting Triennial was brought to life in the spirit of rivalry, in a way, to counterweight the dominant role of Estonia in regulating the regional art communication. And it was 1969, the next year. And the Triennial of Young Artists, it's already the end of the 70s, on the other hand, was at least partially motivated by the conservative hierarchies in Lithuanian painting and the decreased access of young Lithuanian artists to a triennial. For example, I think that one might assume that this special platform for young people had an impact on the former triennials as well, and dragging away new and potentially more experimental energy. For me, these exhibitions, of course, offer a promising prospect to exceed national viewpoint. And in the project, I actually, these Baltic triennials would serve as both a framework and a domain of historical research. I found these formats of triennials quite intriguing. But at the same time, the seriality of Baltic triennials make them especially valuable source to monitor the dynamics of changes in the cultural politics and power relations, with changing perceptions in the center-periphery relations, institutional mechanisms, ideas and value orientations. And luckily, these 3 triennials are very well covered in media. I might be wrong, but I think it was a second print triennial which had 12 or 14 different reviews in Estonia media, so it was huge. Unfortunately, the archives have not been very kind to me yet, and but I still work with that. So maybe I find more interesting materials from archives as well. So, in the 70s and 80s, these Baltic triennials offered the most lively platform for transnational communication of Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian artists. The existing research on Soviet era exhibitions in Estonia, at least, has primarily dealt with the showcases at the alternative spaces, such as cafes, Pegasus Cafe, for example, or research institutes as Harku and Saku exhibition. Although the Baltic triennials have also retrospectively been represented as an example of resistance to Soviet regime, fostering Baltic separatism, in many respects, these exhibitions challenge the narrative of the resistance, I think. These triennials undoubtedly offered a revitalizing transnational perspective. The competitive climate of exhibitions motivated the distinguishing characteristics of national art schools and had an important role in national identity creation. In post-Soviet Estonian art historiography, national discourse has mainly been described as a defense mechanism in opposition to Soviet regime. However, it would be oversimplification to describe the Soviet nationalities policy as straightforwardly suppressive. The in-depth explorations describe the interrelationship between the national and Soviet discourses more as controversial than contradictory. And it went through a number of transmutations during the Soviet era, and despite the thesis of drawing together the cultures of Soviet nations into an integrated single Soviet culture, the national particularities in visual arts were promoted rather than muted, since the end of the 50s at least. What's more, although these triennials were initiated from below by the artists themselves, the Baltic operation as such was very much officially encouraged and cultivated. Also, we saw it in Karolina's paper. For example, as in Soviet systematic colonialist practice of holding cultural regions joint exhibitions in Moscow. In Baltic case, there was the first one was in 1960, the second one in 66, and the last one in 73. But we already planned one in 41, but because of a war, it just didn't happen. But it is kind of encouraged officially, certainly. But over time, the central authorities' pre-screening and oversight in the selection and exhibition process relaxed, and Moscow took more of a backseat role as an intermediary. And as I said, the last joint exhibition of Baltic countries, art exhibition of Baltic countries in Moscow was 1973. But this relative independence from central powers, however, seems to have also had a reverse effect. The strengthening of self-censorship and increasing conservatism. And this leads to one of the proposition of mine in this project that, in my research, that beginning as a platform for more experimental art trends, it appears that since the late 70s or even a little bit earlier in the mid-70s, the triennials took over some of the functions of these highly official representational exhibitions. They didn't start it like that, but they changed to this. The former change in a way. The experimental stance of the first triennials was quite rapidly supplanted by the requirement of a prestige factor and high manual quality. And we can speak about censorship of professionalism, not that much ideological or political censorship. And this is also indicated by the rhetoric of a coverage of the triennials, where such exhibition objectives as diversity, mapping of new trends, and the discovery of young talent began to be replaced by the aim of presenting the best works of the past 3 years. And here on the slide you see some of the works from the very first exhibition, from the 68, and they do look quite experimental in this context, to my mind at least. So, and the more professional the organization of this, at least the Tallinn Print Triennial was more boring. The exhibition was, especially with Estonian, not pavilion, but Estonian display. And quite soon, these reviewers started to speak about stagnation. And it's quite interesting that this discourse of stagnation actually arises firstly in Estonia in the context of its print triennials. And it later, in the end of 70s, of course, it's over. It's everywhere already, but it starts, and I think it's quite telling and important. Right. Okay. Let's see. The field of influence of Baltic triennials remained quite narrow throughout the Soviet era. Yet these exhibitions were considered a part of a global, international biennial world by the organizers. In regard to Tallinn Print Triennial, at least the changes in format from national representations to more curated expositions of the most well-known biennials as Paris, Venice, Tokyo, as well as Ljubljana, were attentively observed and discussed. The reception of print triennials exposed growing contradictions between the horizons of reviewers' expectations, increasingly considering the international artistic context, and the art cultivated by the narrow Baltic Triennial exhibition format, intermingling the discourse on the crisis in the avant-garde with stagnation. And although the sustainability of a model of this international art forum biennial on a narrow regional scale was quite seriously discussed in the late 70s in Estonia, the exhibition reviews and archive documents also reveal the hesitation in opening up more internationally. They ask, what Estonian art has to offer to the world? And it seems that this comparison between the art of Baltic states still reassured the reputation of Estonian print high. So this, and although they see it's not very well working, this format anymore, but it's a secure and safe place to show the art. And this, I think this reluctance to globalization or internationalization makes one, or at least me, ask if these national defense mechanisms are perhaps more common as strategies of small or more marginal cultures, rather than resistance to Soviet regime alone. And I'm already drowning with these three triennials, 20 years, 3 countries. But I think that I should expand also my research to at least to some smaller northern countries, biennials or triennials, to really compare the situations. Maybe the same problems really arose there. So it might not be this problem of Sovietness alone. And I also would like to offer maybe a little bit different meaning for this Baltic separatism as well. Now I quote, this quotation is, you can see from it's Mark-Allan Schwede, who was this foreign Latvian art historian, still very active. And in his book he writes, identity-conscious Latvians sought to accentuate their differences not only from Homo Sovieticus, but also from Homo Lituanus and Estonius. Issues of self-definition largely uncontemplated before Soviet annexion. Of course, Lithuanians and Estonians, especially Estonians, also endeavored to demarcate national differences. And speaking precisely about these Baltic triennials, he says, critiques of these essentially international shows, published dependably in the Latvian journal Māksla, divine the ways in which Latvian art diverged from that of its neighbors. Year after year, commonplaces of Baltic art historiography were parroted. Estonian art is precise and rational. Latvian, some examples, Latvian is monumental and classicist, and Lithuanian, colorful and expressive. Estonians excel at graphic art, Lithuanians at sculpture, and so on. And I have to say that my observations confirm Svede's point. During these 20, I'm even not trying to comment these pictures, as you can see, these national particularities really visible here, aren't they? During these last Soviet years of triennials, the vocabulary of reviews changes really very little. And this difference in value orientations could be perhaps illustrated by the fact that Estonian reviewers of this Vilnius painting triennial actually failed to recognize the new generation of Lithuanian painters. The great change of picture subjects to ugly side of everyday bus stops, wires and tubes, dustbins, still seem to represent the same old painterly expressionism. And maybe, I don't know, maybe this Baltic separatism is something else, separatism in between the Baltic countries in a way, and they seem to work more like a self-affirmative way, like building up your own identity and not really comparing and not really maybe being so interested in the other friends. Pictures of neighboring countries somehow. Mm-hmm. These were my ideas for today.